Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Human Rights and Migration. Before we get started, I just want to check in to see if everyone can see the screen. So if you can see the screen, if you could just type in the chat screen that you can see it, that would be really helpful. So I will wait for that to pop up. But thank you for joining today's webinar. As I said, our webinar is entitled Human Rights and Migration, and it's being sponsored by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, also known as Speci, and has been organized by Speci's Graduate Student Committee. I'm Cindy Lucas, Speci's Communications Director. I will now turn the webinar over to Noelle Malvar, who moderates today's panel and serves as the chair of the Graduate Student Committee. Today's webinar will run for about 1 hour. Our speaker today is Professor Jacqueline Baba, and she'll take about 40 minutes for a lecture and leave some time at the end for questions. So now I'll turn it over to Noelle to talk about the content of today's webinar.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Hello, everyone. My name's Noelle, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I first want to just give a short spiel about Speci, about the organization, and then I'll jump into introducing today's speaker and also the topic. And so you can see my screen, I hope. I wanted to talk a little about Speci. So what is Speci? It's the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. And what it is a group of over 3,000 scientists and practitioners from psychology and other related fields who share a common interest in researching the psychological aspects of social and policy issues. So it's really about bridging theory and practice. We are an independent society and also part of the American Psychological Association, as well as an affiliate of the American Psychological Society. Most importantly, we welcome the membership of anyone interested in joining Speci, and you'll see the website or the URL for the website on the slide. So it's just www.speci.org. So you can click on that, and everything you would need to know about what the organization is and about joining is on that page, plus a lot of other resources. Like Cindy said, so I am part of the Speci Graduate Student Committee. So I'm a graduate student at the Graduate Center in CUNY, and I am also an officer in the Speci Graduate Student Committee. And so what we do is a lot of stuff. So we have conferences, we organize webinars such as this, and we really aim to provide student members, so graduate students anywhere, and in whatever field, the resources to navigate their graduate school experience or transition into early career, and also resources for anyone who's in any stage of their career. We have conferences and pre-conferences and webinars and also newsletters. We also have awards and fellowships and elections if you are interested in joining Speci as a student member and also as running for officer in the GSC, then I highly encourage you to do that and to just click on these links. This PowerPoint will be posted afterwards, so you can just navigate through that webpage and join us. Okay, so we have 2 upcoming policy-focused events that I would like to just plug in. The first one is happening this June 28th. So the Speci will be having their conference from the 29th to July 1st, but the day before is the pre-conference, and one of the pre-conferences is a conference about bridging research to policy, so building a social media presence. And as it says on the screen, it will have scholars, scientists, etc., talking about how to use social media to amplify our work and to engage with the real world outside our universities and respected bubbles. Um, it's very, both of these events are very student friendly, prices wise, so I encourage you to sign up. And the other big one is the pre-convention, the LGBTQ advocacy workshop in San Francisco, on Wednesday, August 8th, sponsored, and that one's sponsored by Speci and also APA Division 44. So that one has lots of great speakers, and there will be more information about that closer to the date. But I encourage you to sign up or to at least find out more about it and to decide to sign up eventually. Okay, so I think that was it for my announcements. I would like to now introduce our speaker. So Professor Jacqueline Baba is professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and she is also the director of research at the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. So from 1997 to 2001, Professor Baba directed the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago, and then prior to that, she was a practicing human rights lawyer in London and at the European Court of Human Rights. So she has published extensively on different issues like transnational child migration, refugee protection, children's rights, and citizenship. So she currently serves on the board of the Scholars at Risk Network and the World Peace Foundation, the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, and as well as the Journal of Refugee Studies. In addition to that, she is a frequent advisor to UNHCR, UNICEF, and other civil society organizations working on forced migration-related issues. So today she will be talking about Human Rights and Migration, which is the title of her talk. And I will turn it over to her now. And and if you have any questions too, you can type it directly there should be a chat box on the webinar pop-up, and I'll get to your questions at the end of Professor Baba's talk.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Noel and Cindy, for inviting me to give this lecture. I hope you can hear me well, and thank you all of you who are listening in for attending. As you just heard, my topic today is global migration, and I'm going to talk about the human and the policy challenges that this global migration raises. And what I would like to do is to discuss what I see as the growing gap between regular and safe migration on the one hand, and what I would call distressed migration on the other. And I want to address this gap because from my perspective, it's a very problematic gap with serious human rights consequences, because some of the individuals and populations that we cover, and we are all part of them, enjoy free movement more or less, whereas other populations don't. And this difference is often inversely related to needs, so that those with the least ability to move often have the greatest need for it. Regular legal migration, which I think many of us have participated in, many of us perhaps very frequently, comes in many different types of situations. So there's, of course, migration that facilitates access to employment and to educational opportunity. Maybe some of you listening have been in that situation as foreign students or students going to internships abroad and so on. There's also migration that helps people to reunify with family who've maybe migrated earlier. but also migration that enables one to realize other life aspirations, migration for business, migration for opportunity, migration even for tourism and for fun. So many different types of migration which are generally regular and legal and for which people have no difficulty crossing borders. On the other hand, there is what I just referred to as distress migration, which covers the increasingly hazardous and protracted movement of populations who need protection, who need new opportunities, or who need escape options from their current life. And so distressed migration includes large populations of refugees, of people who are fleeing war or disaster who may not be considered refugees for technical reasons, and also large populations who may be experiencing stigma, exclusion, or discrimination of one sort or another. And many of these populations have no access to legal migration channels, and so they're forced to rely on criminal organizations or on smugglers to charge very high fees in order to cross borders. Paradoxically, for example, today, there is really no regular way for most refugees to reach a country where they seek protection. It's a shocking state of affairs, and I think it comes as a surprise to many. So my presentation today is actually going to focus on this aspect of migration, on distress migration, and on the often dramatic human rights violations that are associated with it. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to try and consider some current international and domestic moves to address some of the most serious problems that are taking place within this field of distress migration. So to start with, I think it's often and rightly pointed out that migration is one of the moral issues of our time. In fact, it's hard to think of a time when public engagement with migration policy globally has been as evident and as polarized as it is now. I think we all have realized that migration policy are central political issues. They've driven dramatic electoral upsets, both in the US and in Europe, and dramatic diplomatic realignment between countries. So much so that we often seem to be at some sort of a crossroads with virulent nativism on the one hand and vigorous cosmopolitanism on the other, engaging in daily duels. Now, why are these duels occurring now, we may ask, given that migration is a constant fact in human history from time immemorial, and given also that there is, in some ways, increasing convergence and interdependence globally that brings in many ways countries and peoples closer together. So why now? And I think it's not easy to answer this question because there are many factors, I think, which contribute to the current state of affairs. Just consider the current situation in the US briefly, where migration is becoming a site of increasingly restrictive and forceful government enforcement. Three examples briefly. One, and many of you may be aware of this, nearly 800,000 young people with no criminal record and with an overwhelming preponderance of their life spent in the US are now living in what we can only really describe as a nightmarish limbo of uncertainty, while the US president and his advisors vacillate over whether the program that protects them, the so-called DACA program, should be continued or repealed. I don't know what the situation is like in CUNY, but in my university, there are several hundred students in this situation. And the psychological distress has clearly been exacerbated by current political moves, distress which aggravates, if you like, ordinary adolescent angst and insecurity that many students experience. Secondly, there are stories daily in national and local papers and on chat shows and on other media about long-standing US residents being incarcerated or even deported for minor legal infractions. I heard just 2 days ago about someone who had been a legal resident of the US for 40 years with an American spouse and children, deported just because he left the scene of a car accident before the police arrived. And third, of course, there is the impact on American children citizen children of this sort of set of policies, the stress, you might call it the toxic stress, that often leads to enduring health consequences. We know that there are at least 3 million US citizen children who have undocumented or irregular status parents, children who live with the daily anxiety of deportation. And we also know that this administration has now, very much out of line with international policy and practice elsewhere, started separating families when they arrive at the southern border to seek asylum, detaining parents and putting children and babies as young as 6 months in different places in foster care, away from their parents. So mother in detention, baby in foster care, a situation which is a dramatic violation of everything we know about the importance of early childhood development and security. So this is just a very broad sketch of where we are in this very polarized situation in the US. A little further afield in Europe, the situation is also pretty alarming. According to the International Organization for Migration, over 14,000 people, a mixture of different types of distressed migrants, have drowned in the Mediterranean just since 2014, and 1/3 of these 14,000 people were children. These drownings aren't climate related. They aren't a reflection of dramatic climate change. No, they're a measure of the desperation of people, of the dereliction of responsibility for managing safe migration that characterizes contemporary governments. This breakdown in state responsibility for managing effectively migration flows spills over into many domains. So it is not just drownings that we need to be concerned about. In my center, we recently documented widespread violence and sexual abuse against refugees in Greece, violence which occurs within poorly supervised and badly lit camps where drastic overcrowding, destitution, filthy conditions combine with despair and rage to fuel a very dangerous living environment. And we also revealed, shockingly, pervasive child sexual exploitation, unaccompanied children, in the cases we studied, boys actually, selling sex in broad daylight in central squares in Athens in order to get money, often money to pay smugglers to help take them out of Greece to situations where they would be able to earn to send money home to their families. So many of these children are trapped in very exploitative situations and have very little, if any, access to social welfare or child protection, even though they are the responsibility of the state in which they are residing, whether it's Europe or America or anywhere else. And another area of my current research concerns the situation in Libya, where tens of thousands of refugees and other displaced migrants are now blocked trying to enter Europe now that the route from Turkey is no longer available. And so they find themselves in places which are basically lawless and controlled by criminal gangs, often in detention, being asked to pay ransoms before they can be freed. And we are looking at the impact this has on children and that the repatriation programs, which send children back from Libya to the countries they fled in the first place. All of these examples of policies which are keeping migrants out of the destination countries they want to get to. And you could even talk about situations much further away from us here, situations in South Sudan, situation of the Rohingya refugees in Myanmar. There are unfortunately a plethora of examples of dramatic human rights hardships for these distressed migrant populations. So given this dire picture of protection failures and hardship, it might be somewhat surprising to discover that indeed millions of people travel very easily, as I said at the beginning, crossing borders with great ease and at an unprecedented rate. And this is the gap that I was mentioning. So according to the UN World Tourism Organization, there were over 1,000 million international trips in 2016, a nearly 4% increase on the year before. And in the US alone, 390 million people entered the country legally and safely in 2016. And similarly, large numbers are available for Europe, for Australia, and for other countries. So it's not right to say that the whole migration system is in crisis. Rather, the system is not working for some people who need it desperately, but it is working perfectly well for others. So we don't really have a migration crisis, I would argue. We have a protection crisis. Now, there are several reasons why I think there are several aspects of this current reality that are indicative of serious systemic breakdown and that have led to some of the excesses that I just mentioned. One is that refugee protection systems do not work as they were intended to. Refugees now spend decades in situations that were meant originally to be temporary. So 10 years in a refugee camp where you're not allowed to work, where you're cut off from society. And this is a situation which is true of quite sizable numbers of refugees, maybe 10% of the refugee population. And if you think of populations like the Palestinians or Somalis living in refugee camps in Kenya, some of these populations are now onto the third generation being born in a refugee camp, a dramatic systemic failure. Another indication of our failure to manage distress migration is the very bad distribution of responsibility for hosting and protecting refugees. 86% of refugees live in the poorest countries in the world, often in inhospitable and isolated areas where the possibility of self-sufficiency, of reconstructing a viable life is remote. Perhaps most egregious of all is the growing sense that millions have no legal or safe exit strategy available to them because they don't meet any legal criteria. And so their choice is to be trapped in what they consider to be an unlivable or hazardous situation, or to embark on dangerous and sometimes life-threatening migration. And that's why I think we have found ourselves in this situation where so many people are making these very dangerous journeys. It's not that people are foolhardy or that people haven't weighed up the risks. It's just that the risks on the other side seem even greater. And the distress migration isn't just a question of those fleeing acute conflict, such as refugees from Syria or from the murderous genocide in Myanmar or the civil war in South Sudan. It also covers people fleeing because of the impact of climate change or other environmental harms or disasters. And it also covers a whole range of people who simply don't fit into legal categories, as I just said. So think of many thousands of African teenagers who face a life of unemployment and penury, and yet they can see on the smartphone that they have the possibility of what seems like a much better life elsewhere. Think of Central American women desperate to leave their neighborhood where gangs threaten the life of their small children. Or think of the situation of Afghan youth who are trying to find resources to support perhaps a widowed mother or younger siblings in their country that has now been at war for over 30 years. And examples like this are unfortunately very numerous. And so just to summarize my argument so far, I think we have a situation where we have a robust international system for managing movement for some sections of the population and a very fleeting situation and response for others, refugees and others in refugee-like or distress situations. To explore solutions to the current situation, I think it's first important to understand some of what I consider to be the big picture drivers. Any serious answer to the question, how do we fix migration, how do we improve things, has to deal, of course, with the many different political and economic forces that impinge on the situation and with the many different social actors individuals, governments, regions, international organizations. But according to me, the main drivers of the current situation are actually quite clear, and it's also quite clear that we're not addressing them adequately. And so I thought I might just usefully list what I see as the most significant drivers of the current situation before I talk about some of what I consider to be some of the solutions. So the first, I think, and most significant factor propelling displaced migration is conflict, both inter and interstate conflict. And I don't think this will come as much of a surprise to anyone. Events in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria and Sudan have made this abundantly clear. And it's also clear that if we do not deploy radical diplomatic and geopolitical measures to reduce conflict, refugee flight, other types of humanitarian flight will not decrease. In fact, they will increase as people continue to flee for their lives. And yet, unfortunately, the evidence we have suggests that our world is not getting less conflictual, it's getting more conflictual. According to research conducted by the Center for Systemic Peace in Scandinavia, while global conflict did decrease by 60% between 1991 and the early 2000s, the trend has since then been reversing. The Peace Research Institute in Oslo, for example, reports that the number of armed conflicts rose from 41 in 2014 to 50 in 2015, and that the trend continues to move upwards. It's not just the number of conflicts, it's also the length of time that they last. Many wars now last for long periods of time, exacerbating the impact on affected populations, and of course reducing the chances of voluntary return home. For example, over 60% of the distressed migrants who fled to Europe in 2016 came from the top 10 refugee-producing countries, and the same is true of the US. So this migration is of people who are desperate to flee. It's fueled by a search for survival, not other motives which are often attributed. And so from this vantage point, diplomatic intervention is essential to replace the military tools that we seem to rely on more and more. And political leadership is essential to generate effective strategies for negotiation. And yet here we are at this moment, as we are conversing with brinkmanship or in evidence around negotiations with North Korea, with Iran, which suggests that we're not moving at all in the right direction. So conflict is a major issue. And I think for anyone who's concerned about reducing the distressed migration flows, it is a prime target. But there are other drivers. And second, I want to mention climate change and the related humanitarian disasters. These are often, in fact, themselves contributors to conflict because all these factors are interconnected. Climate change and often produces disasters like water scarcity or flooding or torrential rain, other types of hazards, earthquakes, tsunamis, which then lead to movement and lead to acute competition over scarce resources. And so, for example, the conflict in Syria was clearly related to environmental pressures related to land use and to water scarcity as population moved east to west and exacerbated ethnic tensions. And here too, unfortunately, the incident rate is increasing, not decreasing. There were 3 times as many natural disasters in the first decade of the century as there were between 1980 and 1989. And yet, people who are fleeing natural disasters are not covered by the International Refugee Convention, and there is no international legal status that they can avail themselves of if a country decides not to give them humanitarian protection. So if you're fleeing a dramatic earthquake or you're fleeing flooding, you don't have a claim to a legal status if you cross the border, and that's how you could well become undocumented or irregular. So an urgent policy imperative is for us to address much better than we have the issue of environmental refugees and to develop a robust, shared, agreed international framework for humanely managing the inevitable large-scale flows of people that will arise from these factors. There are two other drivers of distress migration that I would just like to briefly mention. And all these, of course, are huge issues way beyond the scope of one talk. But I don't think there's any way else to understand why we're in the situation we're in. Migration is not just a question of poor border control or greedy outsiders, obviously. It is a result of complex global pressures, which we need to understand better than we do. So the second set of drivers, the last two drivers that I want to mention are the following. One is global inequality, of course, and the related poverty. Much large-scale migration in response to these factors, of course, is regular and legal. It's legally sanctioned labor migration covered by bilateral agreements, by labor mobility schemes. Just think of the very large-scale migration from South and East Asia into the Gulf, or think of many other labor agreements that regulate the arrival of agricultural workers or of other types of labor. So this, however, is not the migration that generates a sense of crisis or conflict. Not to say that there aren't serious human rights violations sometimes involved, even in these legal migration contexts, severe labor exploitation, sexual harassment, and so on. But at least those migrant workers have a legal status, and they're not as vulnerable as they would be if they were undocumented. But by not addressing income inequality more aggressively, we do perpetuate a world order which drives more and more people, especially young people, to embark on risky and often harmful migration as their only exit option from what they see as penury and the despair associated with it in this country. And so, despite dramatic income gains in some historical countries of emigration like China and India, poor and unskilled migrants from developing countries working in the global north still are likely, if they make it, to have a dramatically greater income. Probably they'll earn in 1 week more than they would have made in a month at home. And so the propelling, the force, the impact of desire to move and to take advantage of this opportunity is great. And it's not just that people willfully decide to leave home, because in fact the default choice is to stay at home. But the decision to embark on dangerous migration is a response to a sense of insecurity, economic insecurity, lack of aspirations for the future, and often lack of robust social protection, health insurance, access to education for your children. And so this lack of hope and the sense of despair is what we're seeing more and more with young populations, especially from Asia and Africa, moving across continents in search of what they consider to be a better life. And we have to address this. So a central element in strategies that are necessary to address this inequality and this poverty associated with it are strategies to create minimum social protection, so minimum floors where people have a sense that there's a social network should things go wrong. And interestingly, the United Nations, in its current version of development goals, so-called Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, has addressed this issue centrally. So one of the Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG 1.3, specifically identifies the need, and I quote, to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, minimum standards, and so to achieve by 2030, which is the deadline, substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. So this sort of sustainability framework would make an enormous difference to the pressures to migrate, obviously. Stabilizing failing local and state government structures could really help make neighborhoods safer, make families more secure, give young people hope. And so many of the resources that are now spent on policing borders or dealing with homelessness and crime could be redirected, I think, in much more profitable ways to support these minimum social protection floors. Finally, the last major driver, I think, of distress migration flows are demographic trends, which are contributing more and more to strong migratory pressures. Just consider the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, we find a region which has, at the same time, the highest rate of increase of the primary school age population, and also the highest rate of increase of numbers of primary school kids out of school. So you see a complete mismatch here between dramatic population rise on the one hand and failing infrastructure, lack of adequate opportunity. And remember, this is all happening in a context in which people are aware of circumstances elsewhere. People don't live in kind of geographical silence anymore. And so these, of course, this sense of lack of provision, if you like, discrimination in one's own home base contributes to migratory pressures. So that's a very strong set of push factors, if you like. At the same time, declining fertility rates in many of the traditional migration destination states are generating the opposite pressures. So if you think of Western Europe, or you think of the wealthy countries in Asia, or you think, beginning to be the case even in the US, in Northern America, we have what you might imagine as an upside down triangle with more and more people in the 65 and in the over 85 bracket, and less people at the kind of apex of the pyramid in the child and adolescent and youth and young adult ranges. And so you have a situation in which a growing number of elderly people are depending on the labor of fewer and fewer young people. So clearly these trends represent a massive challenge to which no quick or summary solution will be found. And as I just already said, building a wall or intercepting migrants at sea or indulging in large-scale arrest are not going to provide solutions. They would just be very short-term temporary fixes which create hardship for many. But to conclude, despite this bleak picture, I think there are some very positive moves taking place, both at the local and the national and regional and international level. And I'd like to briefly touch on these in closing. So I think many of us are aware that at the local and at the national level, despite the often inexorable shift towards exclusionary policies, and I mentioned some of these in the start of my talk, there is also evidence of outpouring of great solidarity and support, civil activism, challenges to anti-immigrant policies, sanctuary cities, sanctuary procedures, many examples, and this is true in many cities, in many states, in many countries, of engagement by ordinary citizens in the lives of outsiders whose fate they have compassion for and want to address. So these are constituencies which are voicing demands for inclusion and for non-discrimination, for humane and just policies. And I think we see evidence of this in many schools, in many universities, in many workplaces. Many of us have seen evidence of this, at airports or in railway stations, where large numbers of citizens gather to help newly arrived populations or to offer support or food or water as best they can. And states too have agreed in many contexts to engage in high-level and sustained reform to improve the way in which these irregular migration flows are now managed. And I think one of the most interesting and hopeful signs is that as part of this sustainable development process that I just mentioned, the SDG process, the UN has now decided to include migration and the improvement of migration management as a development goal. And this is a hugely important milestone. When the UN launched its ambitious roadmap for the second set of development goals, the 2030 SDG agenda, migration was very much on world leaders' minds. And at the first meeting to announce the Sustainable Development Goals to guide international and domestic development planning for the next 15 years, the UN clearly recognized the positive contribution made by migrants to inclusive growth and sustainable development. And this itself is a sea change, I think, from former attitudes. It acknowledges that migration is normal and positive, and it's not just to be seen as a risk, an economic burden, or a security challenge. And the UN went further. It noted the challenges and suffering caused, and it decided for the very first time to launch as a consensus goal an agreed target for migration. One of the Sustainable Development Goals has a specific target, a specific kind of campaign focus on migration. And this target 10.7, if you want to look it up, of the Sustainable SDGs, says that the international community commits itself to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people. So clearly, if this goal really is taken to heart, if both developed and developing countries really push towards funding and political commitments to move in the direction of realizing this SDG 10.7, then one has the possibility of dramatic reform. And I'm pleased to say that the UN is now creating two so-called global compacts, one a global compact on refugees and one a global compact on migrants, which provides a forum for states, civil societies, citizens, academics, experts, immigrant organizations to work together to try and find good policies. And many of us are intimately involved in this process. So personally, I've done some work. For years, I've been working on issues related to child migration. And I, for the last 2 years, have been closely involved in drafting principles and guidelines for states on how child migrants should be treated. And we're getting a lot of traction. States are discussing these principles and are committing funding, training, and new resources. So I think that there are signs that despite the bleak picture that we see everywhere, there are many actors that are moving concertedly together in a better direction. Now, of course, this is not a simple or linear process. And I think it's imperative for many different players to get involved in different ways. I think, for example, that one of the most critical areas that needs attention is the situation of young people. I think we need to think of ways of making educational possibility and opportunity much more broadly accessible. We need to think of scholarships, we need to think of exchange programs, we need to think of development aid that specifically targets young people who don't have the means otherwise to study abroad, to do internships, to get apprenticeships, so that they create a skill set that they can then take home. And I think there are many ways that we can creatively do this, also creating online resources that elite universities provide for free, thinking of exchange programs, thinking of blended classrooms, which technology now makes available. So I'm just throwing out some ideas here at the end to say that I think there's a rich canvas of possibilities that each of us in our different domains can develop to contribute to this otherwise very bleak and dramatic situation. You know, I think for those of you who are engaged in psychological work, the need is immense, the need for mental health support, the need, whether this is a need in schools, a need in hospitals, a need in city halls, the need for some sort of resilience training and support for people who have lost so much is critical. And so I think that instead of seeing this as a bleak crisis that others have to solve, I think we have an obligation to ourselves engage in possibilities for change. So maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that talk. That was very, very illuminating. And I will just quickly turn to the questions. And let me see. Okay, I have some questions here, and I'll actually start off with my question. So I was thinking about this as you were talking, and specifically in the situation of the United States. And I know that the issue has somewhat, or not somewhat, but has really been politicized here. And the talk is on the vetting process of refugees and migrants. So, like, what do you think of the current vetting process of the United States? Like, are we doing enough to facilitate like the taking in of refugees, or is it very restrictive, or is it the other extreme where it's too lenient?
Thank you for that. I think that we're not doing enough. I think that when we're in a situation where we face one of the largest humanitarian crises in over 70 years, for the richest country in the world to be now taking in the lowest number of refugees that it has for decades is a real dereliction of duty. So the first point is I think we're not doing enough. Historically, the level at which refugee admissions from abroad to the US was set was 70,000, and it then increased to 90,000. And under the previous administration, there was a promise to admit 100,000. And now the figure has been cut right back to, I think, 20,000. So this is a dramatic decrease. And even within that 20,000, the vetting procedures are very protracted and very extensive. So I don't know of any cases of people who've been admitted as refugees who are found to have then later on have lied about their backgrounds. I think the vetting process is extremely thorough. I think the problem is that we are not letting in enough people and not sharing the resources that we have with people who would be able to make a huge contribution to the society. That's my view.
Okay. And then I want to turn to a question by our audience. So the question is and I think you touched on this a little. So what can we do as individuals and professionals to, I guess, aside from being aware of all these numbers and statistics and current events, like in our day to day, what can we do to help with the protection crisis?
Thank you for that question. It's great when people ask like that. I think that there are many different levels at which people can help. I think, from the big picture political levels of, lobbying your senator and, participating in demonstrations or public events to show support, to very small individual ways of finding organizations in your community that are supporting refugees, and all communities have those, and volunteering to teach English to children or to accompany people to help them open a bank account or to help them when they go to hospital. There are many, many ways when people have, lost everything and come to a new society that they need help. So, and very often these are very rewarding engagements. I think, for those of us who are researchers, there are many important roles documenting what's happening, including in this country at the southern border. As I mentioned briefly, that now we have this bleak situation where children are being separated from their parents. So, there are people working in the detention facilities trying to advise families. That's a very demanding, the facilities are quite remote. You have to travel to Texas, and then it's quite far from there. It's quite a commitment, but there are organizations facilitating that. So there are ways in which people can volunteer, and doing that is arduous, but it is, of course, extremely rewarding. You really make a difference to people's lives. So I think, there are many different ways in which people can contribute by becoming involved, becoming interested. And what's so encouraging, I think, is that so many people have done that. In Germany, for example, at the height of the migration crisis, over 1 in 10 Germans of the whole population were engaged every day in some form of activity with newly arrived migrants. Either some activity, whether it's just helping with food, or whether it was accompanying people, something, playing football. I mean, there was so much engagement. So I do think it's possible to get involved in those ways in one's local community. And each community is different, so one has to find out what's needed wherever it is that you live.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess this might be related. So another question is specifically about young adults in higher education or administrators. I guess working in the university context, how can we frame our contributions to include like the migrant's voice?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think there are at least two things we can do. One is we can, as professors and teachers, we can try to make our courses available online. We can try to pair up with universities elsewhere. So there are several great examples of universities that have links with universities in developing countries, in places where refugees can access. And so sometimes you can establish like a virtual classroom, or where that's not possible, you can have systems of accreditation, and people have done that, so that people can take courses remotely and then get credit. But in terms of making it possible for migrants and refugees to actually access higher education in their destination, their new countries, again, there are several schemes. Often it's, there are language issues, there are cost issues. There are some schemes already in place to help people in some countries. So there are schemes, I know that this exists both in the UK and in some other European countries, to make it easier for people to access, to have kind of bridge courses that enable them then to take university classes, for example. I know that there are universities in the US which do need blind admission and are often anxious to admit people who have refugee backgrounds and in a way show preference to people who've had particular hardships. So I think there are ways to do that. And I think even in one's teaching, it's important then to solicit different voices so that you don't just have a dominant narrative, whether it's from the professor or whether it's from the students, but you try to democratize in a way the opinions that are expressed in the classroom. So I think many of us are trying to do that. I'm actually co-editing a book on access to higher education for vulnerable populations, which will be out in about a year or so, which will have a lot of examples of good ideas and good practice in precisely this domain. So I hope that will be helpful.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, we're looking forward to that. And I think we can end there on that positive note. And thank you again for doing this talk, and not just for doing this talk, for all the work that you do. And I will be briefly turning it back to Cindy, and she will wrap it up with a few other words. So thank you, Professor Baba.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It was really a great talk, and I personally learned a lot. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We will be downloading the audio from the webinar and making it available on our YouTube channel. We'll also follow up with everyone who registered and who was online today for the webinar with the URL for the webinar, so that you can follow up on our YouTube channel and revisit this conversation when you would like to. Feel free to forward it to your colleagues and share it with them, and share it on your social media channels. Also, stay tuned for more information about stream of internationalization programming that we're going to have available from our Speci summer conference in Pittsburgh, and that will be made available very soon, and we will send that information out to everyone. And thanks again for joining us. We hope that you'll join our webinars again when we have them scheduled, both at the conference and in the fall. Thanks again.